Crisis, we are joined by Serhat Güvenç, an associate professor of international relations at Kadir University in Istanbul. And in Doha, we have Salman Sheikh. He is the director of the Brookings Doha Center and fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy. Here in Beijing, we have Mr. Li Guofu, director of the Center of Middle East Studies at the China Institute for International Studies. Welcome to the program, gentlemen. First of all, may I address this question to you, Mr. Sheikh? What do you think about nature right now that is going on the ground inside Syria? Is it about government troops cracking down on peaceful demonstrators, or actually there is already a civil war evolving in front of all of us?
Well, it's very good to be with you. For the past few months since the uprising started in March, we have seen effectively peaceful protesters with the regime cracking down heavily. I think over the last 4 to 6 weeks, I would in fact say since early October, the time of the UN Security Council actually vetoed a resolution on Syria, we've seen the gradual militarization of this conflict. We now in effect do have army defectors primarily fighting against government troops, which has meant that in November, we're not even all the way through it yet, but we've seen the highest death toll, over 330 people killed. So yes, we've entered a new phase now, I think, in the Syrian conflict.
And as a result of that, first of all, the Syrian government, the Assad government, was trying to dispute the numbers. Having said that, though, as a result of the change of nature of the conflict inside Syria, Mr. Li, is it wise for the international community or some countries to have just what they call military intervention inside Syria?
I think, the perspective of outside the military intervention into Syria at this moment is not very likely because, all the regional countries against, and as well as the international community, I believe that the opposition inside Syria and also are strongly against any foreign interfere into Syria's internal affairs. But, maybe later on, in some point, I'm not sure about that, whether, the foreign intervention, especially the military intervention into Syria would be happened. But at the moment, it's not very much likely to happen.
Well, Mr. Li, some have been saying, well, it seems that Russia and China are saying that no military intervention. Previously, Russia and China also vetoed the UN Security Council resolution. So is China really on the side of Syria? Many ask that question, and some international media's reports are stating exactly that. Do you agree?
No, I think, what China's principle is, we hope that, as I said that, China supported, the Arab League proposal, which is calling for the stop of the violence. What China is the policy, not only we are adopted to not interfere into Syria's internal affairs, but mostly we believe that, the best interests for the Syrian people is to have stop violence by all sides and settle down to have sort of a dialogue, negotiations, to work out a feasible and workable plan for the future. That would be the best for the Syrian people.
Right. Mr. Güvenç, though, we see your country, Turkey, has been actually reacting quite passively, rather passionately this time, toward the crisis going on in Syria. What do you think about the possibility of military intervention? Is it really going to bring stability inside that specific country?
Well, I don't think Turkey is considering military option very seriously at this point. Indeed, the Turkish policy towards the evolving situation in Syria has been to forestall an outside military intervention and to let domestic forces shape the final outcome. And therefore, at this point, it will be very difficult for me to argue that Turkey will be supporting international military intervention. It is probably it will be thought as a last resort measure. So what Turkish policy is geared towards currently is to kind of tighten the grips around the Syrian regime by joining the sanctions, imposing and enforcing sanctions on Syria and hurting the current regime economically. I think we're still far from the military option. At least this is how it looks from Ankara.
At this moment, Mr. Shaikh, we are talking about the peaceful plan proposed by the Arab League and also the emergency plan proposed by the Arab League. 3-day deadlines that is passing by very quickly. What if the Assad government is not doing exactly like what the Arab League has prescribed, or in the way that the Arab League as a whole would like it to be when it comes to implementation? What does it mean, do you think?
Well, let's just be clear what the Arab League is asking for. It's asking first and foremost for the violence to end and for the Assad regime to withdraw its troops, and for all violence to end, and for the protection of civilians. That is first and foremost. Since the Arab League made that demand in early November, we've had more killing, and in fact we've had more violence, including now reprisal attacks from so-called army defectors. The Arab League's deadline has actually passed last night, and now we are hearing that they have not accepted proposals from Walid al-Muallim and the Syrian regime for some sort of amended monitors in the country. As a result, I believe the Arab League will now look to see what other measures it can take, including economic sanctions, which can pressure the Assad regime, first and foremost, to stop the violence and to focus on the protection of civilians.
Right. Mr. Shaikh, you said something very interesting earlier, because when it comes to a conflict, there are two sides. Both the Assad government and also the opposition has to act. But at this moment, it seems, according to media reports at least, neither side is acting towards that specific goal in the degrees they should. And therefore, Mr. Shaikh, how should we see the two sides of the conflict in this regard, and whether the international community's point toward the Assad government is only one-sided, or rather calls should be made to both sides, and in what degree?
Well, I have to say here, on the question of violence, there is no moral equivalence. It has been the Assad regime which has been perpetrating the violence, and in fact, as I said before, we've largely had peaceful protesters throughout the country who have been coming out asking first for reforms, and then, as the violence continued, for the Assad regime to go. The opposition has come forward with plans now for the transition, and that has happened over the last few days. We will see the Arab League and Turkey, for example, now engaging in serious discussions with them about a post-Assad Syria. In terms of trying to equate the opposition and the regime, I think this is something which is now becoming more and more difficult to do. Increasingly, the isolation of the Assad regime, and it's not just the Arabs, it's also the Turks, it's also others in the region, as well as, of course, the Western countries in Europe and the United States. This is now leading us to a dialogue with the opposition more so now than with the Assad regime.
However, inside the country, Mr. Güvenç, I would ask you about this. Inside the country of Syria, it seems that the opposition, if we call it opposition, has not been at this moment be able to spread its advocacy and solicit support among the public inside some of the most important cities of the country. For example, the capital, for example, some of the other second and the third largest cities in that specific country. And therefore, how can we see the proceedings going on right now to talk with the oppositions and totally giving up on the Assad government? Or there actually should be more strategies, more well-rounded strategies for that?
Well, again, it's a fluid situation, but from the statements of the highest Turkish government officials, we can say that they feel like they had it enough with Assad and the Syrian regime. So on my way to the studio today, I heard a press conference by Turkish president on his way to make a foreign visit, and he said the situation, the Syria is headed for a dead end. Therefore, at least in Ankara, obviously the Turkish officials gave up hope on the Syrian regime and President Assad. For a while, they thought they could talk him into, making reforms and ensure that a smooth and peaceful transition could take place. But now they're weighing other options, and they don't see any reason at this point to engage with the current Syrian regime and President Assad to put into effect some kind of a political change. The opposition, if we may call it, has been demanding so far. And the Turkish position has evolved in step with the changing nature of the conflict from peaceful demonstrations to kind of armed resistance in the country. And they're hosting, and this is quite unprecedented in Turkish history, that my country is hosting an armed opposition group trying to change the regime in a neighboring country. So this is a big change, and we see that probably Turkey will be more and more involved in the evolving situation, but not through military means.
All right.
There has been great reluctance to.
I see. Yes, but as you said, the situation is very fluid. And just a few days ago, President Assad did say this. He said there's going to be a new parliament next year. There's going to be a new government, and there's also going to be a new constitution. And as a result of that, the constitution, there's going to be a new election. If he's not being elected, he is going to step down. He's ready for that. But he also said if foreign military intervention goes on, he is ready to die, in his words, for his country. Mr. Lee, and therefore, how much should we believe in President Assad, in his statement at least, for prescribing to the future about his country and his personal role inside his country right now?
I think, at this point, everyone is clearly about the true, I think, the nature of the Syria's issue. The issue now in Syria is not the issue of democracy, and has already been given to the issue of geopolitics. So, whatever, the Assad has said, whatever he promised to the people would not be accepted by, the Western countries. The Western countries' strategy in Syria now is try their best, try to, to overthrow Syria in order to change the balance of the power in the region, especially, the regions. The power, the balance between the Shia community and the Sunni community, and the anti-American community and the pro-American community. So the key issue in Syria is geopolitics, not democracy.
All right. And Mr. Shaikh, before we go, final question for you. First of all, how do you see the sectarial divide inside Syria if the Assad government gone? What does it mean for the country? Will it become still a secular country, or it's going to be very much divided and killings going on as a result? Secondly, how do you see the situation in Syria? What does it mean, really, for the overall big picture that we're talking about here when it comes to the changes going on in the Middle East?
Well, in terms of the sectarian cleavages in the country, these are something, of course, that we have to be mindful of. It is also something that you hear from members of the opposition, actually. Many are aware that if the country descends into a sectarian civil war, Syria will be lost for generations, which is why if you look at the political platform now being produced by some of the opposition groupings like the Syrian National Council, there is a very heavy focus on national dialogue and on the rights of minorities. In particular. What kind of Syria are we talking about in the future? And well, Syria is a pivotal state in the Middle East, as we've talked before. It borders 5 of the most important countries in the region, including, of course, Iraq, as well as Jordan and Turkey, and Israel. And so what happens in Syria will certainly affect the Eastern Mediterranean and more broadly. But let me just say that we all are interested in the stability of Syria in the future, stability which will also make a much more stable region. The problem is that the trust deficit that this current regime now unfortunately suffers from, most importantly from its own people, not in the geopolitics, but from its own people, is now making it a factor for instability.
I see.
And as a result, we're now seeing more violence, and we will continue to see that until and when we have a solution, probably with the end of this regime.
We hope that solution will not be a violent one, at least. Salman Sheikh, Li Guofu, and Serhat Güvenç, thank you so much for being with us, gentlemen. Thank you very much. When we come back, why a new government in Libya is bringing about concern amongst many women. But first, here's a look at some of the other stories that made news in the past 7 days.
Day of action. Thousands of protesters marched on New York Stock Exchange in an attempt to shut down Wall Street on Thursday. They marked 2 months since the Occupy demonstrations began there. More than 200 people were arrested and 7 police officers were injured. The protest took place 2 days after New York police evicted demonstrators camping out in Zuccotti Park. Voting day. People in Spain are electing a new government. The poll is taking place 4 months before the full parliamentary term expires. Spaniards were enraged at the ruling Socialist Party, which failed to stimulate economic growth. More than 45% of people surveyed before the poll said they'd vote for the center-right Popular Party. Super Mario. Economist Mario Monti was officially sworn in as Italy's prime minister, taking over for Silvio Berlusconi, who resigned last week. Monti formed a technocrat government to steer the country from financial disaster. He's seeking sacrifices from across the political spectrum to get the economy growing and rebuild market trust in Italy. Under arrest, former Philippine President Gloria Arroyo was apprehended while in hospital in Manila. Prosecutors accuse her of electoral fraud, which, if convicted, could carry a life sentence. Arroyo was scheduled to leave the Philippines to seek medical treatment for a rare bone disease in Singapore, but she was stopped from leaving the country. Her arrest comes 18 months after President Benigno Aquino won an election by vowing to fight corruption.
We're here to announce
and
that
still locked out. Players from the National Basketball Association rejected the league's latest offer and filed a lawsuit against the governing body, leaving another 2 weeks of games canceled. Players are seeking $6 billion in compensation, triple the amount of salaries for this season. The rejected bargaining agreement called for a 50-50 split of basketball-related income on a 72-game season beginning on December 15th. But players remain at odds with the owners over governing contract rules.